before I do any measurements, I'd like to make sure that nobody else has already done the measurements or done experiments on what I want to do. I spend a lot of time going through scientific journals as new journals are published, and I go and I read the table of contents, and if there's an article that's in my field, I read it. So I spend a lot of time reading literature. I think one of my colleagues has a saying like 10 minutes in the library could save you 10 months in the laboratory. And what it means is maybe somebody's already done what you were planning on doing, so you should know that before you spend a long time doing it. Once you know that you have a researchable idea, it's really important to evaluate what you want to study systematically so that you make sure you to make sure you're prepared for any potential outcome that could happen. So one example of this was watching water freeze in wood. So when water freezes, it gives off heat, and you can observe that in a machine called a calorimeter. And when water is free within the wood and it's not bound, it's just like in like holes and open space in the wood, that water when it freezes gives off a peak. Water in wood could also be bound to the wood, like the wood cell wall, so it could be bound within the wood. And if it's bound to the wood, then it doesn't freeze and you don't see any freezing peaks. And some people had found what they called this type 2 water, which froze, but it didn't freeze like free water. And so they had this theory that, oh, well, it's bound to wood, but it's very loosely bound to the wood. And that's why it exhibits this different freezing behavior. We had expected to see type 2 water in all the specimens that we tested. And we looked at wood, we looked at isolated components from wood, we looked at wood that was prepared a whole bunch of different ways. But it turned out that we only saw type 2 water in wood that had been ground really violently, so it was like really damaged. And then we realized that this type 2 water wasn't freezable bound water as other people had hypothesized, but it was actually an artifact of how people had prepared the samples when they saw the type 2 water. And we were only able to determine that type 2 water was an artifact of sample preparation and not a real physical thing because we had this systematic experiment set up where we looked at a whole bunch of different types of wood and wood components prepared a whole bunch of different ways so that we were able to determine that, hey, you only see this peak when you really damage the wood. So in school, you spend a lot of time talking about the scientific method, and there's nothing wrong with the scientific method as you learn it in school. I think a lot of what I do generally follows the idea of the scientific method that you learn in school, but in the real world, it's not always practical to follow it so rigidly as you learn it in school because experiments take time and they cost money. And as a researcher, I need to make the best use of my time because there's too many measurements that I want to take and I don't have enough time to take them all. Before I write out the whole, hypothesis, type thing and this is what I'm going to test and this is how I'm going to test it, I just walk down to the lab. I don't spend a lot of time, I don't spend a lot of money, and I just kind of pretend I'm like a mad scientist and mix a whole bunch of things together and see what I find. And in these like very informal, inexpensive experiments, I think then after I have some of that data, then I can go through and come up with a more formal study plan with a more formal hypothesis and the types of things I want to take measurements on. But I think if you don't have any preliminary data before you start coming up with your hypothesis, that it might lead you down a very unproductive path.
Visit the Natural Enquirer website for more information. There you can learn more about planning to test your own question.